The fiddle case landed in the snow with a soft thump, and Rosalind Harper's frozen fingers fumbled with the brass latches as the wind howled through the mountain pass like a creature in pain. She had been walking for 3 days since her wagon wheel shattered on the rocky trail, carrying only what she could manage on her back. And now the December cold of 1878 was settling into her bones with a finality that terrified her. The map the shopkeeper in Elko, Nevada had sold her was worthless, the promised mining camp nowhere to be found, and she was alone in the wilderness with nothing but her father's fiddle and the foolish dream that had brought her west. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she struggled forward through the drifts, each step requiring more effort than the last. The sun was already sinking behind the peaks, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if they had not signaled the approaching night. She knew she would not survive another night in the open. The previous 2 had nearly killed her, huddled beneath her inadequate blankets, shivering until dawn. The cabin materialized out of the twilight like a mirage, solid and square against the darkening trees. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and Rosalind felt tears freeze on her cheeks at the sight. She stumbled toward it, her legs barely supporting her weight, and managed to raise one numb fist to pound on the heavy wooden door. She was still pounding when it swung open, and she nearly fell across the threshold into the warmth beyond. The man who caught her was enormous. That was her first coherent thought as strong arms steadied her, keeping her upright when her legs finally gave out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with muscles that showed clearly even through his worn flannel shirt. Dark hair fell past his collar, streaked with strands of silver despite a face that could not have been much past 30. His jaw was shadowed with several days of beard, and his eyes were a startling pale gray that studied her with an expression somewhere between shock and alarm. "Please," Rosalind managed through chattering teeth. "I am lost. The cold." He did not speak, but his actions were immediate and efficient. He swept her up as though she weighed nothing and carried her to a chair near the fire, then began pulling off her frozen boots with gentle hands that seemed too careful for their size. Rosalind wanted to protest, to maintain some shred of dignity, but she could not make her mouth form the words. She sat trembling while he worked, wrapping her feet in wool blankets and pressing a tin cup of something hot into her hands. "Drink," he said, and his voice was rough and deep, like a sound pulled from somewhere long unused. The liquid burned going down, some kind of herbal tea sweetened with honey, and Rosalind felt warmth begin to spread through her chest. She drank it all, then accepted a second cup while the man moved around the cabin, banking the fire higher and pulling more blankets from a wooden chest. The cabin was small but well built, a single room with a sleeping loft above, furnished with handmade furniture that showed skilled craftsmanship. Furs covered the floor and dried herbs hung from the rafters. It was the home of someone who had learned to live alone and to live well. "Thank you," Rosalind said when she could finally speak without her teeth chattering. "I thought I was going to die out there." The man nodded, settling himself on a stool near the fire but not too close, as though trying to give her space. Up close, she could see the details of his face more clearly, the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the surprisingly long lashes that framed those pale eyes. There was a scar along his left temple, faded with age, and his hands were calloused and scarred from hard work. He was powerfully built, with the kind of muscles that came from chopping wood and hauling water and surviving in the wilderness year after year. "My name is Rosalind Harper," she said, trying to fill the silence. "I came from Illinois. I was supposed to meet my cousin in a mining camp north of Elko, but my wagon broke down and I got lost and the map I bought was completely wrong and—" She trailed off, realizing she was babbling. The man watched her with those unsettling gray eyes, and for a long moment she thought he might not answer. Then he said in that same rough voice, "Dalton Harding." "Mr. Harding," Rosalind said, "I cannot thank you enough for taking me in. I will leave as soon as the weather clears and not impose on your hospitality any longer than necessary." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "Storm coming," he said. "Week, maybe more." Rosalind felt her heart sink. A week trapped in this tiny cabin with a strange man in the middle of nowhere. But the alternative was death in the snow, and she was practical enough to know which she preferred. "I understand," she said. "I will try to stay out of your way." Dalton stood and moved to a shelf, returning with a hunk of bread and some dried meat. He handed them to her without ceremony, and Rosalind realized she was famished. She ate while he prepared some kind of stew in an iron pot hanging over the fire, moving with the easy competence of someone who had cooked for himself for years. As she ate, Rosalind's gaze fell on the fiddle case she had somehow managed to keep hold of through everything. It was battered and stained with snow melt, but when she opened it with trembling fingers, the instrument inside was undamaged. Her father's fiddle, the last thing he had given her before the fever took him. She had played it at his funeral, and at her mother's grave 6 months later, and when the creditors had taken their house in Chicago, she had packed it carefully and headed west with dreams of starting fresh. "You play?" Dalton's voice startled her from her thoughts. "Yes," Rosalind said. "My father taught me. He was a music teacher back in Illinois. He always said music was the closest thing to magic he had ever encountered." Dalton was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then he said softly, "Been a long time since I heard music." "How long have you been up here alone?" Rosalind asked. 12 years. Since '66. 12 years without another human voice, without conversation or company or any of the small comforts of civilization. Rosalind could not imagine it. "You must be very self-sufficient," she said. "Had to learn." Dalton ladled stew into a wooden bowl and handed it to her. "Trap in winter, pan for gold in summer. Trade furs down in Elko once a year for supplies. It is enough. Do you not get lonely?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she saw something shudder behind his eyes. "Got used to it," he said, which was not really an answer. They ate in silence after that, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. The cabin was warm now, and Rosalind felt the bone-deep exhaustion of her ordeal beginning to catch up with her. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she struggled to stay awake, not wanting to be rude to her host. "Sleep," Dalton said, noticing. "Take the bed. I will be fine by the fire." "I could not possibly take your bed," Rosalind protested, not asking. His tone left no room for argument, and Rosalind was too tired to fight. She climbed the ladder to the loft, finding a narrow bed with a thick mattress stuffed with pine needles and a mountain of furs piled on top. She burrowed under them, still wearing most of her clothes, and sleep took her almost instantly. She woke once in the night to the sound of wind screaming around the cabin, and the knowledge that without Dalton Harding's intervention, she would be dead in that storm. The thought made her shiver, and she pulled the furs closer and sent up a prayer of gratitude to whatever providence had led her to this door. When she woke properly, gray morning light was filtering through the single window in the loft. She could hear movement below, the sound of wood being added to the fire and water being poured. Rosalind descended the ladder to find Dalton already dressed and preparing breakfast, some kind of porridge with dried berries mixed in. "Morning," he said, glancing up. "Good morning." Rosalind felt awkward and out of place in her rumpled traveling dress. "Is there water for washing?" Dalton pointed to a basin near the door, already filled from the large pot that hung beside the fire. The water was warm, and Rosalind washed her face and hands gratefully, trying to make herself presentable. When she turned back, Dalton was setting 2 bowls on the rough-hewn table. They ate together, and Rosalind tried to think of something to say that would not sound foolish. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wind outside. Finally, she said, "The storm sounds terrible." "It will get worse before it gets better," Dalton said. "Good thing you found shelter when you did. Is this your land?" "No one's land, really. Too high up for anyone to care about claims. The miners stay lower down where the gold is. But you find gold, enough to trade for what I need. I am not looking to get rich, just to live." There was something in the way he said it that made Rosalind curious. What had driven this man to isolate himself so completely from the world? But she sensed that pressing him would only make him retreat further, so she finished her porridge in silence. The day passed slowly. The storm Dalton had predicted arrived in full force by mid-morning, and soon the wind was shrieking so loudly that normal conversation was nearly impossible. Dalton moved around the cabin checking for drafts and reinforcing the shutters, while Rosalind tried to make herself useful by tidying up the few dishes and reorganizing the dried goods on the shelves. It was clear he did not need her help, that he had managed perfectly well on his own for over a decade, but she could not simply sit idle. By afternoon, the cabin had grown dim despite the early hour, the storm blocking out the sun. Dalton lit a few precious candles and settled by the fire with what looked like a trap he was repairing. Rosalind watched his large hands work the delicate mechanism with surprising dexterity, bending the wire and testing the spring until it snapped shut properly. "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked. "To wherever you came from?" His hands stilled for just a moment. "Nothing to go back to. No family. Dead, all of them." The flatness in his voice told her not to pursue that line of questioning, but Rosalind found herself wanting to understand. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I lost my parents too. It is a terrible thing." Dalton looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been recognition. A shared grief, perhaps, or just the acknowledgement that they both knew what it meant to lose everything. "How did you end up out here?" he asked. So Rosalind told him. About her father's death from pneumonia. About her mother following him 6 months later from what the doctor said was a weak heart, but what Rosalind knew was a broken one. About the debts they had not known existed, and the creditors who had taken the house and the furniture and everything except what she could carry. About her cousin Martha, who had written from Nevada about the opportunities in the mining camps, about the need for teachers and seamstresses and anyone willing to work hard. "Martha was supposed to meet me in Elko," Rosalind said. "But when I got there, they told me she had moved on to a camp called Silver Creek. So I bought supplies and a map and hired a wagon. The driver got me about 20 miles out before his horse went lame, and he said I could wait with him for help or continue on foot. I chose to walk. Stupid, I know." "Brave," Dalton said. "Or desperate. Sometimes they are the same thing." "Both, I think." Rosalind managed a weak smile. "And now I am here imposing on a stranger's hospitality because I was too stubborn to wait for help. You would have died waiting. That driver was not going to get help. He probably went back to Elko and sold your wagon for scrap." The casual way he said it made Rosalind realize he was probably right. She had been so naive, trusting a man she did not know just because he had offered a reasonable price. "Well," she said, "at least I still have my fiddle." "Play something," Dalton said suddenly. Rosalind blinked. "Now, storm is not going anywhere. Might as well have music." She could not argue with that logic. Rosalind retrieved her fiddle from its case, checking it over carefully for any damage the journey might have caused. The wood was fine, the strings intact, though it would need tuning. She did that by ear, adjusting each string until the notes rang true, and when she looked up she saw Dalton watching her with an expression of intense concentration. "What would you like to hear?" she asked. "Anything. Everything. I do not even care." So Rosalind played. She started with a simple folk tune her father had taught her, an Irish melody that spoke of green hills and lost loves. Her fingers were stiff from the cold and the long days of walking, but they remembered the music, and soon the notes were flowing smooth and clear through the cabin. She played that song through twice, then moved into a livelier dance tune, the kind of thing that would have had people clapping and stomping in the taverns back home. When she glanced at Dalton, he was completely still, his eyes closed and his head tilted slightly as though he was drinking in every note. His face had softened in a way she had not seen before, the hard edges smoothed by the music, and Rosalind found herself wondering what he had looked like before 12 years of solitude had carved those lines around his mouth. She played for over an hour, moving through her entire repertoire of songs. Happy tunes and sad ones, fast dances and slow ballads. Her fingers grew tired and her shoulders ached from holding the instrument, but she kept playing because Dalton had asked, and because the look on his face made her want to give him this gift. Finally, she lowered the fiddle and flexed her cramping fingers. "I need to stop for a bit," she said apologetically. Dalton opened his eyes and she was startled to see they were bright with moisture. "That was." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I had forgotten what music sounded like. Thank you." "It was my pleasure," Rosalind said, and meant it. There was something profoundly moving about playing for someone who appreciated it so completely, who had been starved for it for so long. "Your father taught you well," Dalton said. "He loved music more than anything, except maybe my mother." Rosalind smiled at the memory. "He used to say that when words failed, music spoke, that it was the language of the soul." He was right. Dalton stood and added more wood to the fire. "I used to sing, before." "Before what?" He was quiet for so long that Rosalind thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Before the war." "Before everything. The war. That would have been the Civil War, over now for 13 years, but still a wound in the nation's heart." Rosalind waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say. "I was at Shiloh," Dalton said finally, staring into the flames. "Fought for the Union. Lost my brother there and my best friend, and a piece of myself I never got back. Came home to find my parents dead from cholera and the farm sold for taxes. Had a girl waiting for me, or so I thought, but she had married someone else while I was gone. Could not blame her. I was presumed dead for nearly a year." "I am so sorry," Rosalind said inadequately. "Spent a few years drifting. Working odd jobs, drinking too much, getting into fights. Then one day I woke up in a jail cell in Sacramento and decided I was done with people. Came up into these mountains and built this cabin and figured I would live out my days alone." He turned to look at her. It seemed easier that way, safer. Could not lose anyone else if there was no one to lose. Rosalind understood that impulse more than she wanted to admit. After her mother died, she had considered doing something similar, just disappearing into herself and shutting out the world. But her father's fiddle had saved her, the music reminding her that beauty still existed even in grief. "I think I understand," she said quietly, "but it must be lonely." "It is." Dalton's admission was barely above a whisper, "but lonely is better than hurt." "Is it?" Rosalind asked. "I am not sure anymore. Sometimes I think the hurt is what proves we loved in the first place. If we never risk the pain, we never get the joy either." Dalton looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Then he said, "Play something else, please." So she did. And as the storm raged outside and the firelight danced across the walls, Rosalind Harper played her fiddle for Dalton Harding and felt something begin to thaw inside both of them. The storm lasted for 4 days. 4 days of howling wind and snow that piled up higher than the cabin's windows, sealing them inside in a cocoon of forced intimacy. Rosalind had worried it would be awkward, trapped in such close quarters with a man she barely knew, but instead she found herself settling into an unexpected rhythm. They fell into routines without discussing them. Dalton would wake first and build up the fire, and Rosalind would make breakfast from the supplies he showed her. They ate together. Then Dalton would work on his traps or carve small wooden figures while Rosalind mended clothes or read from the single book she had brought with her, a collection of poems by Walt Whitman. In the afternoons, she would play her fiddle, and Dalton would listen with that same expression of hungry attention. On the 3rd day, something remarkable happened. Rosalind was playing a simple melody, one of the first songs her father had taught her, and without warning Dalton began to hum along. The sound was rough and uncertain, as though his voice was rusty from disuse, but it was there. He was making music with her. Rosalind almost stopped playing in surprise, but she caught herself and kept going, letting the melody line out long and slow so Dalton could follow it. His humming grew more confident, and she could hear him finding the harmonies, his deep voice blending with the fiddle in a way that made the simple tune suddenly rich and full. When the song ended, they sat in silence for a moment. Then Dalton said, "I did not know I could still do that." "You have a good voice," Rosalind said truthfully, "deep and strong. Have not used it for singing in 12 years, not sure I even remember any songs all the way through." "I could teach you," Rosalind offered, "if you wanted." Dalton considered this, then nodded slowly. "I think I would like that." So that became part of their routine too. Rosalind would play a phrase on the fiddle, and Dalton would repeat it back, humming or sometimes venturing actual words if he knew them. He had a good ear and a natural sense of rhythm, and Rosalind found herself enjoying the challenge of teaching him, of watching him rediscover something he had thought was lost forever. They talked more as the days passed. Dalton was not naturally talkative, but Rosalind learned to read his silences, to understand when he needed space, and when he was just thinking through his words. He told her about his childhood on a farm in Pennsylvania, about learning carpentry from his father, and how to track animals from an old trapper who lived nearby. He talked about his brother Samuel, younger by 2 years, who had enlisted on the same day and died at Dalton's side in a muddy Tennessee field. "I tried to save him," Dalton said, his voice rough with old pain. "But there was too much blood, and the fighting was still going on all around us, and he just looked at me and said it was all right. Like dying was all right. It was not all right." Rosalind reached out and touched his hand, a brief pressure of comfort, and was surprised when he did not pull away. In turn, she told him about her life in Chicago, about teaching piano to rich men's daughters who did not really want to learn, about the small apartment she had shared with her parents above a bakery. She told him about her mother's garden on the roof, a little patch of green in the dirty city, and how after her father died her mother had stopped tending it and let everything wither away. "I think she wanted to follow him," Rosalind said. "The doctor said her heart gave out, but I think she just stopped fighting, stopped wanting to be here without him." "They were lucky," Dalton said, "to have that kind of love. Yes, even if it ended badly, they were lucky to have it at all." On the 4th day, the storm finally broke. Rosalind woke to sunlight streaming through the loft window, bright and almost blinding after days of gray. She climbed down to find Dalton already opening the shutters, revealing a world transformed by snow. It was beautiful and pristine, the trees heavy with white and the sky a brilliant blue. "I will need to dig us out," Dalton said, "and check the snares, make sure we still have food coming in." "Can I help?" Rosalind asked. He looked at her skeptically. "Have you ever walked on snowshoes?" "No, but I can learn," Dalton almost smiled. "I guess you can at that." He found her a pair of old snowshoes that he had to adjust to fit her smaller feet, and then spent an hour teaching her how to walk in them without tripping. It was harder than it looked, and Rosalind fell more than once, but Dalton was patient, and his large hands were gentle when he helped her up. They worked together to clear a path from the cabin door to the woodpile and the small shed where Dalton kept his tools. Then, Dalton led her through the forest to check his trap lines, pointing out tracks in the snow and teaching her to read the signs of animal movement. 2 of the traps held rabbits, which Dalton dispatched quickly and efficiently, and Rosalind tried not to think too hard about where their dinner came from. "You do what you have to do to survive up here," Dalton said, noticing her expression. "Nature does not care about sentiment." "I know," Rosalind said. "I just never had to kill anything before. Could teach you. Might need the skill if you are planning to stay in this country. If," the word hung between them. Rosalind had been trying not to think about what came next, about the fact that the storm clearing meant she would need to leave soon. The thought made her chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with the cold air. "I still need to find my cousin," she said, "and figure out what I am going to do with my life." Dalton nodded but did not say anything else. They walked back to the cabin in silence, and Rosalind found herself memorizing the landscape, the way the mountains looked with snow on them, the particular blue of the winter sky. She was memorizing Dalton too, the set of his broad shoulders and the way his breath misted in the cold air. That evening, after a dinner of rabbit stew, Rosalind played her fiddle again. This time Dalton did not just hum along. He sang actual words to an old ballad about a soldier coming home from war. His voice was rough from disuse but true, and it carried a weight of emotion that made Rosalind's throat tight. When the song ended, Dalton said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For reminding me I was human. That I could still feel things, make things." He paused. "For making me want to sing again." Rosalind set down her fiddle and looked at him across the firelight. He was watching her with those pale gray eyes, and there was something in them now that had not been there before. Something open and vulnerable and a little bit afraid. "I think you reminded yourself," she said softly. "I just provided the music. It was more than that." Dalton shifted on his stool, looking uncomfortable but determined. "These past few days, having you here, it made me realize how much I have been missing, how much I cut myself off from." "It does not have to be that way," Rosalind said. "You could leave the mountain, go back to civilization." "Could not do that. This is my home now, but maybe." He trailed off, then tried again. "Maybe it does not have to be so lonely if someone wanted to stay." Rosalind's heart was suddenly beating very fast. "Dalton, I know it is too soon," he said quickly. "I know you barely know me and you have your own plans and your cousin to find. But I wanted you to know that if you wanted to stay, you would be welcome. More than welcome." The offer hung in the air between them, huge and terrifying and unexpectedly tempting. Rosalind thought about the cousin she had never met, about the uncertain future waiting for her in some mining camp. Then she thought about this cabin, this man, the way music had brought both of them back to life over the past few days. "I do not know," she said honestly. "This is all very sudden. A week ago I did not know you existed. I understand." Dalton stood, moving to add wood to the fire even though it did not need it. "I am sorry. I should not have said anything." "No," Rosalind said. "I am glad you did. I just need time to think." He nodded, not looking at her. "Of course. I will take you down to Elko whenever you are ready." help you find your cousin." The thought of leaving made Rosalind feel hollow, but she pushed the feeling aside. She needed to be practical, to think clearly about what she wanted her life to be. She had come west to start over, to find independence and opportunity. Getting trapped on a mountain with the first man who showed her kindness was not a plan. It was desperation. But as she lay in the loft that night, listening to Dalton move quietly around the cabin below, Rosalind could not help but think about the way his face softened when she played music. About his gentleness, despite his size and strength. About the careful way he taught her to walk in snowshoes and read animal tracks. About the courage it must have taken for him to open up after 12 years of choosing solitude. She thought about her parents, too, about the kind of love they had shared. Her father used to say that you knew you had found the right person when being with them felt like coming home. Rosalind had thought she understood what he meant. But now, lying in Dalton's bed wrapped in his furs while he slept by the fire below, she wondered if maybe she was beginning to truly grasp it. The weather held clear for the next 3 days, and Dalton used the time to prepare for the journey down to Elko. He checked over his snowshoes and packed supplies, and Rosalind helped him dry meat and bake hardtack that would keep for the trip. They did not talk about his offer, but it was there between them, an unspoken question that colored everything. Rosalind practiced walking on snowshoes every day, building up her strength and endurance. It was hard work, and she was exhausted every evening, but she was learning. Dalton was a good teacher, patient and thorough, and under his guidance she began to understand the rhythms of this harsh landscape. On the 3rd clear day, Dalton took her to see his claim. It was about a mile from the cabin, a stream that ran swift and cold even in winter. In summer, he explained, he would pan for gold here, finding enough small nuggets and flakes to trade for the supplies he needed. "It is not much," he said, "but it is honest work and it is mine." Rosalind looked at the stream, at the mountains rising beyond it, at the vast sweep of wilderness that stretched as far as she could see. It was beautiful and terrible and completely unforgiving. She could understand why Dalton had chosen it, why he had built his exile here. There was a purity to this life, a simplicity that the crowded, complicated world below could never match. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Leaving everything behind, every day," Dalton said, "and also never. It is complicated." "I think I understand." They stood together in companionable silence, watching the water flow over the rocks. Then Dalton said, "We should head back. Storm coming in tomorrow, maybe the day after. If we are going to make it to Elko, we need to leave soon." Rosalind's stomach clenched. "How soon?" "Tomorrow morning, if you are ready." She was not ready. She did not think she would ever be ready, but she nodded and said, "All right." That evening, Rosalind played her fiddle for what she thought might be the last time in this cabin. She chose her songs carefully, starting with the lively dance tunes that made Dalton's foot tap, and moving gradually toward the slower, sadder melodies. She played a song her father had written for her mother, a sweet waltz that spoke of devotion and partnership and growing old together. Dalton listened with his eyes closed, and when Rosalind finally lowered her bow, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Would you teach me that one, the waltz?" "Of course." So she played it again, phrase by phrase, and Dalton hummed along until he had the melody memorized. Then she added harmony, showing him how the notes wove together, and he followed her lead with that deep, sure voice that sent shivers down her spine. They played it together 3 times, until it was seamless and beautiful, until Rosalind felt tears on her cheeks and could not have said exactly why she was crying. When they finished, Dalton stood and crossed to where she sat, and he reached out and gently wiped the tears away with his thumb. "Do not go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I know it is selfish and I have no right to ask, but please do not go." Rosalind looked up at him, at this strong, damaged man who had somehow found the courage to let her in. She thought about all the sensible reasons she should leave, about the cousin waiting for her and the life she had planned. Then she thought about music and loneliness, and the way home was sometimes a person rather than a place. "I am afraid," she said honestly. "What if this is just because we were trapped together? What if we barely know each other and this is a terrible mistake?" "It might be," Dalton said. "But it might also be the best decision either of us ever makes, and we will never know unless we try." He was right. Rosalind had been playing it safe her whole life, following the rules and doing what was expected, and where had it gotten her? Alone and broke and lost in the wilderness. Maybe it was time to take a risk on something that felt real, even if it was terrifying. "I will stay," she heard herself say. "For a while at least, to see if this is real." The smile that spread across Dalton's face was like sunrise, transforming him completely. He pulled her up from her chair and wrapped her in his arms, and Rosalind felt the solid strength of him and thought, yes, this was real, this was exactly what she needed. "Thank you," he said into her hair. "I will do everything I can to make you happy here. I promise." "Just keep singing with me," Rosalind said. "That is all I need." They held each other for a long time, and when they finally pulled apart, Dalton built up the fire and they sat together on the furs in front of it, talking late into the night. They talked about practical things, about how they would manage sharing the small cabin and what changes they might need to make. They talked about dreams too, about Rosalind maybe teaching music to the children in the mining camps, about Dalton building her a workroom where she could give lessons and practice without disturbing him. "I never thought I would have this," Dalton said at one point. "A partner. Someone to build a life with. I thought I had used up my chance at that." "I never thought I would choose to live on a mountain," Rosalind admitted. "But here we are, he agreed, and he took her hand and held it gently in both of his. They did not kiss that night. It seemed too soon, too much. But they held hands and talked and planned, and when Rosalind finally climbed to the loft to sleep, she felt lighter than she had in months. Maybe years. The storm Dalton had predicted arrived the next morning, but this time Rosalind was not afraid. She was safe and warm and exactly where she chose to be. The winter passed in a blur of snow and music and gradually deepening intimacy. Rosalind learned the rhythms of mountain life, the constant work required just to stay alive in such harsh conditions. She learned to check the snares and skin rabbits, to cook over an open fire and mend clothes by candlelight. Dalton taught her to read the weather and the forest, to understand the language of wind and birds and the tracks animals left in the snow. In return, she taught him music. Every evening after their work was done, they would sit by the fire and Rosalind would play while Dalton sang. His voice grew stronger and more confident as the weeks passed, and he remembered songs he had thought forgotten. Old hymns from his childhood, body-drinking songs from the army, tender ballads about love and loss. They created their own songs too. Dalton would hum a melody that had come to him while working, and Rosalind would figure it out on the fiddle and add harmonies. Some of these tunes were simple and rough, but others were genuinely beautiful, and Rosalind would play them over and over, polishing them until they shone. "We are making something together," she said one night in late January, "creating something that did not exist before." "Like us," Dalton said, and Rosalind had to agree. They kissed for the first time in February, during a brief warm spell that melted some of the snow and brought the first hints of coming spring. They had been walking in the forest, checking traps and enjoying the sunshine, and when they stopped to rest, Dalton pulled Rosalind close and kissed her with a gentleness that belied his size and strength. It was sweet and tentative and perfect, and when they pulled apart, Rosalind was breathless and grinning like a fool. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," Dalton admitted. "Then why did you wait so long? Wanted to be sure you wanted it too." "Wanted to be sure this was not just gratitude or convenience or because you were stuck here with me." Rosalind cupped his bearded face in her hands. "Dalton Harding, I am falling in love with you, not because I am stuck here, but because of who you are. Because you are kind and patient, and you taught yourself to be whole when the world broke you into pieces. Because you sing with me and listen to me and make me feel like I finally found where I belong." "I love you too," Dalton said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "Have loved you since that first night when you played your father's fiddle and reminded me what it felt like to be alive." They kissed again, longer and deeper, and when they finally headed back to the cabin, they were holding hands and stealing glances at each other like young sweethearts. That night, for the first time, Rosalind slept in Dalton's arms by the fire instead of alone in the loft. Nothing happened beyond kissing and holding each other, but it was enough, more than enough. She fell asleep listening to his heartbeat and woke to his fingers gently stroking her hair. "Good morning," he rumbled. "Very good morning," Rosalind agreed. As winter gradually released its grip on the mountains, Rosalind began to think about the future in concrete terms. She was committed to staying with Dalton, but she also needed to let her cousin know she was alive and well. And she wanted to bring some of her belongings from Elko if the wagon driver had not already sold everything. "We should go down before the spring melt makes the trails impossible," Dalton said. "Send word to your cousin that you are safe. Get any supplies we need for the summer." "Will you be all right in town?" Rosalind asked carefully. "I know you avoid people." "I will manage," Dalton said. "For you, I will manage." They made the trip in early March when the snow was still packed hard enough for snowshoes, but the worst of the winter weather had passed. It took 2 days of hard traveling, stopping overnight in a shallow cave where Dalton built a fire, and they huddled together under shared blankets. Elko, Nevada was a rough town, all mud streets and hastily constructed buildings serving the mining camps scattered through the surrounding mountains. Rosalind could see Dalton tense as they approached, his shoulders drawing up and his expression closing off. She squeezed his hand and felt him relax slightly. The first stop was the general store where Rosalind had bought her supplies months before. The shopkeeper, a heavy-set man named Morrison, looked at her in surprise. "Miss Harper, we all thought you were dead." "Nearly was," Rosalind said. "But Mr. Harding found me and saved my life." She gestured to Dalton, who nodded curtly. Morrison looked Dalton up and down with obvious curiosity. "You are the mountain man. We see you once a year when you trade furs. Never knew you had taken up rescuing lost women." "Just the one," Dalton said dryly. Rosalind asked about her cousin, and Morrison directed her to a boarding house at the edge of town. "Martha Henderson runs it. Came through here last fall, decided to stay and set up shop. Does all right for herself." They found the boarding house easily enough, a 2-story structure that looked sturdy if not fancy. A woman in her 30s answered Rosalind's knock, her face breaking into a smile when Rosalind introduced herself. "Rosalind, thank God, I have been so worried. When you did not arrive, I thought the worst." Martha pulled her into a hug, then stepped back to look at Dalton. "And who is this?" "This is Dalton Harding. He saved my life when I got lost in a storm." Rosalind took Dalton's hand. "And he is my fiancé." The word surprised her as much as it surprised Dalton, judging by the way his eyes widened. But it felt right saying it, claiming him publicly and letting the world know they belonged to each other. Martha's eyebrows rose. "That was fast." When you know, Rosalind said firmly. I am staying with Dalton on his claim. I just wanted to let you know I was alive and well. They talked for a while, Rosalind explaining what had happened, and Martha filling her in on the news from home. Apparently, word had reached Chicago about Rosalind's disappearance, and there had been some concern, but no one had the resources to mount a search. Martha had been planning to send inquiries to the mining camps in the spring. Well, I am glad you are safe, Martha said finally, and if you are sure about this. She glanced at Dalton. I am sure, Rosalind said. Martha nodded. Then I wish you both happiness. But you are always welcome here if you need anything. They stayed in town for 2 days, long enough to gather supplies and for Rosalind to retrieve the few belongings the dishonest wagon driver had not sold. Dalton traded his winter furs for a good price and used the money to buy Rosalind a wedding ring, a simple gold band that fit perfectly on her finger. We should make it official, he said when he gave it to her. If you are willing. I am willing, Rosalind said. More than willing. They were married by a traveling preacher in Martha's parlor, with Martha and Morrison as witnesses. It was not fancy or elaborate, but it was legal and binding, and when Dalton kissed her as his wife, Rosalind felt a happiness so intense it was almost painful. They spent their wedding night in a room at Martha's boarding house, and for the first time, they made love with the door locked and real privacy. Dalton was gentle and careful, conscious of his size and strength, and Rosalind marveled at the tenderness of his calloused hands on her skin. Afterward they lay tangled together and Dalton whispered, I never thought I would have this. A wife, a partner, someone who chose me. I will keep choosing you, Rosalind promised, every day for the rest of my life. The journey back to the cabin was easier with their new supplies packed on Dalton's back, and Rosalind felt a fierce joy when the familiar structure came into view. This was home now. Not the cabin, precisely, but the life they were building together. Spring came in earnest, the snow melting into rushing streams and the first green shoots appearing on the trees. Dalton started his panning operation again, spending long days at the creek while Rosalind tended to the cabin and the small garden she had planted. In the evenings, they made music together, their voices blending in harmonies that felt like prayer. In May, Rosalind realized she was pregnant. The knowledge filled her with equal parts excitement and terror. She had no experience with childbirth, and the nearest doctor was a 2-day journey away. But when she told Dalton, he held her close and promised they would figure it out together. My mother had 5 children, he said. She told me stories about all of them, and there are books we can get from Elko. We will learn. So they did. Dalton made the trip down to town and returned with medical texts and advice from the midwife who served the mining camps. They read together by firelight, learning about pregnancy and labor and caring for infants. It was terrifying and overwhelming, but they faced it as they faced everything else, as a team. Rosalind's belly grew round as summer progressed, and Dalton built a cradle from smooth pine, carving it with delicate designs of mountains and trees and musical notes. He was tender and attentive, making sure she ate well and rested enough, and Rosalind fell in love with him all over again watching him prepare for fatherhood. The baby came in December, almost exactly a year after Rosalind had stumbled to Dalton's door half frozen and desperate. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Rosalind was sure she would not survive it. But Dalton stayed with her the entire time, holding her hand and letting her squeeze until his fingers were white. And when their son finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and absolutely perfect, Rosalind wept with relief and joy. They named him Samuel, after Dalton's lost brother, and David for Rosalind's father. Samuel David Harding, born on a mountain in Nevada to parents who had found each other through music and desperation and love. "He is perfect," Dalton said, cradling the tiny bundle with his huge hands. "You are perfect. I cannot believe this is my life." "Believe it," Rosalind said, exhausted but happy. "This is our life, our family." Samuel was a good baby, healthy and strong, and he seemed to love music from the start. Rosalind would play her fiddle to soothe him when he fussed, and Dalton would sing old lullabies in his deep voice until Samuel's eyes drifted closed. They were building something beautiful together, a life of simplicity and purpose and love. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and songs. Rosalind taught music to the children in the mining camps, traveling down with Dalton twice a year to give lessons and share the melodies she and Dalton had created. Their music became known throughout the region, and people would ask specifically for the mountain man's wife to play at weddings and celebrations. Samuel grew into a bright, curious child who loved the wilderness as much as his father and music as much as his mother. When he was 3, Rosalind became pregnant again, and their daughter Rose was born in the spring of 1882. 2 years later came another son, Thomas, and the cabin that had once housed a lonely exile now rang with the sounds of children and laughter and constant music. Dalton expanded the cabin over the years, adding rooms and a proper workshop where Rosalind could teach and practice. He built instruments too, learning from books and trial and error, crafting guitars and dulcimers that he traded in town for supplies. He never lost his wariness of crowds, but he was no longer hiding from the world. He had found a way to engage with it on his own terms, with Rosalind by his side. They made occasional trips to visit Martha in Elko, and the children loved their aunt and the excitement of town. But they always came back to the mountain, to the life Rosalind and Dalton had built together. It was not easy, this life in the wilderness, but it was theirs, and it was good. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dalton gave Rosalind a new fiddle he had crafted himself, made from wood he had carefully selected and aged for years. It was beautiful, with a tone that was rich and warm, and Rosalind cried when she played it for the first time. "It is perfect," she said. "Like everything you have given me." "You gave me more," Dalton said. "You gave me my voice back, my music, my life." "We gave each other those things," Rosalind corrected. "That is what love does." That evening, with their 3 children asleep in the loft above, Dalton and Rosalind sat by the fire and played music together. His voice was as strong and true as ever, no longer rough with disuse, and it blended with her fiddle in the songs they had created over a decade of partnership. They played the waltz she had taught him that first week, the one her father had written for her mother, and Rosalind thought about how music had saved them both. No song had reached Dalton's cabin in the decades before she arrived, but her fiddle had taught him that his own voice could hum, could sing, could create beauty from pain. And in teaching him, she had learned that home was not a place you found on a map, but a harmony you built with another person, note by note, day by day, until the music was so ingrained you could not imagine silence. The children grew, as children do. Samuel showed his father's aptitude for working with his hands and his mother's ear for music, and by the time he was 10, he was composing his own simple tunes on the guitar Dalton had made him. Rose was quieter, more thoughtful, but she had a voice that could make grown men weep when she sang. Thomas was still young, but he showed signs of inheriting both his parents' talents. Dalton taught all 3 of them to track and trap, to read the forest and survive in the wilderness. Rosalind taught them music and reading and arithmetic, using the books they ordered from back east. It was an unconventional education, but it was thorough, and the children thrived under their parents' attention. The mining camps around Elko gradually grew more settled, some evolving into proper towns with schools and churches. Rosalind was approached more than once about moving down permanently to teach music, but she always declined. Her life was on the mountain with Dalton, and she would not trade that for any amount of civilization. When Samuel turned 15, he expressed interest in learning more advanced music theory than Rosalind could teach him. After much discussion, they arranged for him to spend 6 months in San Francisco studying with a professional musician. It was hard watching their oldest child leave, but Rosalind knew he needed more than they could provide. "He will come back," Dalton said, holding her as they watched Samuel ride away with a trader heading west. "The mountain is in his blood." Dalton was right. Samuel returned 6 months later, full of new knowledge and techniques, but also deeply grateful for his home and family. "The city is amazing," he told them, "but it is too crowded, too loud. I miss the silence. I miss being able to hear the wind in the trees." "You are your father's son," Rosalind said fondly. "And yours," Samuel replied. "You both taught me that the best music comes from understanding silence first." As the children grew into young adults, Rosalind and Dalton found themselves with more time alone together. They were in their 40s now, no longer young, but their love had deepened with the years. They still made music every evening, still created new songs and taught them to anyone who would listen. Dalton's hair was more silver than dark now, and Rosalind had lines around her eyes, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the people they had been that first winter, broken and desperate and saved by music. "You ever regret it?" Dalton asked one evening. They were sitting on the porch he had built, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Giving up the life you could have had in town, the comfort and security." "Never," Rosalind said firmly. "This life has been everything I needed it to be. You have been everything I needed." Even when things were hard, when the children were sick or the winters were brutal or we had to make do with almost nothing, especially then, Rosalind said, because we faced all of it together. We built something real, Dalton, something that matters. He pulled her close and kissed her temple. "I love you, have loved you since you brought music back into my life. And I love you, have loved you since you taught me that strength does not mean shutting people out." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, and Rosalind thought about the girl she had been, trudging through the snow toward an uncertain death. That girl could never have imagined this future, this life of richness and purpose. But she had taken a chance on a stranger who turned out to be exactly what she needed. And together, they had created something beautiful. Samuel eventually married a girl from Elko, a practical young woman named Catherine who took to mountain life with surprising ease. They built their own cabin a few miles from Dalton and Rosalind's, close enough to visit but far enough for privacy. Rose became a teacher in town, but she came home every summer to help with the garden and play music with her parents. Thomas chose to stay on the mountain permanently, taking over more of the physical work as Dalton aged. Rosalind and Dalton became grandparents, then great-grandparents. The family gatherings were loud and chaotic, full of children and music and laughter. Dalton, who had chosen solitude for 12 years, now presided over a small dynasty, and Rosalind loved watching him with the little ones, this fierce mountain man who was so gentle with babies. "You were meant for this," she told him once, watching him teach a grandchild to carve wood. "For family and connection." "I was meant for you," Dalton corrected. "Everything else grew from that." They grew old together on their mountain, their bodies slowing but their music never stopping. Even when arthritis made Rosalind's fingers stiff and Dalton's voice grew reedy with age, they still played together every evening. The songs were simpler now, the melodies they had known longest, but they were no less beautiful for their simplicity. On a warm evening in June of 1908, 30 years after Rosalind had stumbled to his door, Dalton and Rosalind sat on their porch and played music as the sun set. Their children and grandchildren had visited earlier, filling the cabin with noise and energy, but now it was just the two of them again. "Play the waltz," Dalton requested. "The one your father wrote." Rosalind played it slowly, her fingers not as nimble as they once were, and Dalton sang in his thin, aged voice. They had played this song thousands of times over 3 decades, but it still moved them both. When it ended, Dalton took Rosalind's hand and said, "Thank you for the music, for teaching me to sing again, for giving me a life worth living." "Thank you for catching me when I fell," Rosalind replied, "for being brave enough to try again after you thought you were done with people." "We saved each other," Dalton said simply. "Yes," Rosalind agreed. "We did." They sat together as the stars came out, holding hands and watching the mountains they both loved. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called, and Dalton hummed a few bars of a song they had written together years ago. Rosalind joined in, and their voices blended in the gathering dark, creating music from silence, connection from isolation, love from two broken hearts that had somehow learned to beat as one. The fiddle that had taught the mountain man to hum, to sing, to open himself to joy again, rested against the cabin wall. And in the quiet of the evening, if you listened closely, you could still hear its echo in the wind, in the voices of children and grandchildren who carried the music forward, in the enduring harmony of two souls who had found each other against all odds and built a symphony from the silence. Years continued to pass like water over stones, smoothing the rough edges but leaving the fundamental shape intact. Dalton and Rosalind aged gracefully together, their bodies growing frail but their spirits remaining strong. They could no longer make the journey down to Elko, so their family came to them, bringing supplies and news and filling the mountain with life. Thomas and his wife had taken over the day-to-day running of the homestead, but Dalton still insisted on doing small tasks, chopping kindling or mending tools, needing to feel useful. Rosalind still taught music to any child who showed interest, her patience apparently endless even when her strength was not. In the winter of 1912, when Dalton was 73 and Rosalind was 68, they celebrated their 34th wedding anniversary quietly in front of the fire. The cabin was warm and comfortable, expanded over the years into a proper home with separate bedrooms for visiting grandchildren, and a music room where Rosalind's collection of instruments hung on the walls. 34 years, Dalton mused, holding Rosalind's weathered hand in his own gnarled one. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday you showed up at my door, half frozen and stubborn. Other times it feels like you have always been here." "Both are true," Rosalind said. "Time is strange that way. You think your father would have approved of me, of this life?" It was a question Dalton had asked before, usually late at night when his thoughts turned melancholy. Rosalind always gave him the same answer because it was true. "He would have loved you." He always said that the measure of a person was not in what they owned or what position they held, but in how they treated the people they loved and the beauty they created in the world. "By that measure, you are the finest person I have ever known." Dalton's eyes were suspiciously bright. "I was not always. Before the war, before the loss, I was angry and thoughtless. The war made me harder, and losing everyone made me bitter. I spent 12 years hiding from the world because I was too much of a coward to risk being hurt again." "You were not a coward," Rosalind said firmly. "You were wounded. There is a difference. Maybe, but you healed me. Your music, your kindness, your stubborn insistence on seeing good in a broken-down hermit. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I hope I gave you even a fraction of what you gave me." "You gave me everything," Rosalind said simply. "A home, a family, a purpose. You gave me the freedom to be myself, to make music and teach and live on my own terms. You gave me love that never wavered even when times were hard. What more could anyone want?" They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Dalton said, "Play something. One more song before sleep." Rosalind picked up her fiddle, the beautiful one Dalton had made her all those years ago, and considered what to play. She settled on a melody they had written together, a simple tune that spoke of mountains and home and enduring love. Her fingers were stiff, and the notes were not as clean as they once had been, but the music was still there, still true. Dalton hummed along, his voice barely more than a whisper now, but still on pitch, still finding the harmonies. When the song ended, he said, "I am tired, Rosie, more tired than usual." Rosalind felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Then rest, my love, I am here." They climbed into bed together, something they had done thousands of times, and Dalton pulled Rosalind close against his chest. She could feel his heart beating, steady and strong despite his years, and she matched her breathing to his. "Thank you," Dalton whispered into her hair. "For the music. For the life. For loving me when I had forgotten how to love myself." "Always," Rosalind promised. "In this life and whatever comes after." She felt him smile against her temple, and then his breathing deepened into sleep. Rosalind lay awake for a long time, listening to him breathe, memorizing the feel of his arms around her. She had known this moment would come eventually, had been preparing for it in small ways for years, but she still was not ready. When morning came, Dalton's heart had stopped sometime in the night, peacefully and without pain. He had died as he had lived the last 3 decades of his life, with Rosalind in his arms and music in his heart. The grief was enormous, a tidal wave that threatened to drown Rosalind completely. But she was surrounded by family, by the children and grandchildren who were the living proof of the love she and Dalton had shared. They held her up when she could not stand alone, and they helped her prepare Dalton for burial. They laid him to rest on a hill overlooking his claim, with a view of the mountains he had loved and the stream where he had panned for gold all those years. The entire family gathered for the service, 3 generations coming together to honor the man who had chosen solitude and then chosen love. Rosalind played her fiddle at his funeral, the same instrument she had played that first night when she stumbled into his cabin half dead from cold. She played the waltz her father had written, and she played the songs she and Dalton had created together over 3 decades of partnership. Her children and grandchildren sang with her, their voices rising in harmony, and Rosalind knew that Dalton would have loved this send-off, this celebration of music and family. In the days that followed, well-meaning relatives suggested that Rosalind move down to Elko or even to San Francisco where Samuel's children could look after her. But Rosalind refused. This mountain was her home, the cabin was full of Dalton's presence, and she would not leave it. "I will stay here," she told Thomas firmly. "Your father and I built this life together, and I am not ready to walk away from it just because he is gone." So she stayed. Thomas and his family lived close enough to check on her daily, and her other children visited as often as they could. But Rosalind spent most of her days alone in the cabin, surrounded by memories and music. She played her fiddle every evening, the same time she and Dalton used to play together. Sometimes she could almost hear his voice joining hers, humming the harmonies he had learned so long ago. She talked to him too, telling him about her day and the family news and the weather. It helped, keeping him alive in her heart even though he was gone. Spring came, as it always did, and Rosalind planted her garden with Thomas's help. She was slower now, her body feeling every one of its 68 years, but she was determined to maintain the routines she and Dalton had established. In the evenings, she sat on the porch and watched the sunset, and she could feel Dalton's presence beside her even though she could not see him. One warm evening in late May, almost 6 months after Dalton's death, Rosalind picked up her fiddle and played the waltz one more time. The notes floated out into the gathering dusk, and she sang the words her father had written about eternal love and partnership. When the song ended, she sat in the silence and felt a deep peace settle over her. She had lived a good life, a full life, surrounded by love and music and beauty. She had known terrible grief, but she had also known joy that made the grief worthwhile. She had been loved completely by a good man, and she had loved him in return, and together they had created something that would outlast them both. Their children carried on the tradition of music, teaching it to their children and grandchildren. The songs Rosalind and Dalton had written together were still played at gatherings and celebrations throughout the region. The cabin on the mountain remained in the family, a symbol of the love that had built it and the life that had been lived within its walls. Rosalind lived for another 8 years, growing frailer but never losing her spirit or her music. She played her fiddle until the day she died at age 76 in the spring of 1920. She went peacefully in her sleep, in the cabin she and Dalton had shared, surrounded by the instruments they had played and the memories they had made. They buried her beside Dalton on the hill overlooking the claim, and the family gathered once more to celebrate a life well lived. Rose played her mother's fiddle, the one Dalton had made, and the sound carried across the mountain like a prayer. The cabin stood for many years after, carefully maintained by generations of Hardings who understood its significance. It became a family gathering place, a reminder of where they had come from and the love that had founded their line. Children learned to play music there, sitting in the same spot where Rosalind had taught their grandparents and great-grandparents. And on quiet evenings when the wind was right, visitors to the cabin swore they could hear music drifting through the trees. The sound of a fiddle playing an old waltz, and a deep voice humming along in perfect harmony, as though somewhere beyond sight, Rosalind and Dalton were still making music together, still creating beauty from two hearts that had found each other in the wilderness and refused to let go. The story of the mountain man who had forgotten how to sing and the woman whose fiddle taught him to find his voice again became legend in the region. It was told and retold, passed down through generations as a reminder that love could heal even the deepest wounds, that music could bridge any silence, and that sometimes the greatest treasures were found not in gold or silver, but in the courage to open your heart one more time. No song had reached Dalton's cabin in decades before Rosalind Harper stumbled through a snowstorm and into his life. But her fiddle had taught him that his own voice could hum, could sing, could create beauty even after unimaginable loss. And in teaching him, she had found her own voice too, her own purpose, her own home. They had saved each other, two broken people who became whole through music and love and the daily choice to build a life together. And that life, with all its joys and sorrows, its hardships and triumphs, its music and silence, was the most beautiful song either of them had ever created. The end came as all endings do, with both sadness and peace. But the music never really stopped. It echoed through the mountains in the songs their descendants sang, in the fiddles passed down through generations, in the stories told around fires on cold winter nights. Rosalind and Dalton's love story became part of the landscape itself, as enduring as the mountains and as constant as the stream where Dalton had panned for gold. And somewhere, In that space between memory and eternity, a fiddle played and a deep voice hummed along, creating harmonies that would last forever.